Welcome to Inside the Mask, the podcast where we cover off all your favorite horror movies with a true crime twist. Today we'll be looking at a more psychological horror film from 2021 that serves as a legacy sequel to the 1992 original. It's the story of an aspiring painter who, after hearing a gruesome local urban legend in the neighborhood, finds himself spiraling into an unhealthy obsession. And as his friends and colleagues begin to mysteriously die in violent circumstances, police begin to believe that he might be the prime suspect. But just like a painting itself, these events are up to interpretation. Is it the work of an obsessed copycat killer? Or is this almost supernatural local legend more than just a story? I'm your host, Evan Taggart, and this is Candyman. It's 1992, and in a busy neighborhood of Chicago, Illinois, a series of violent and seemingly interconnected murders is sending shockwaves throughout the local community. Local university graduate Helen Lyle is developing her thesis, and in turn, she's investigating a string of mysterious deaths in the housing project of Cabrini Green. Now, numerous victims have been found viciously murdered over a period of months here, with the crime scene spanning the neighborhood, and after speaking to locals in the area, the killing is attributed to not a physical person, but rather a spiritual or almost mythical entity, and that entity is famously known by the local moniker of the Candyman. Now, the story of the Candyman has a deep-rooted history here. According to those familiar with the urban legend and that of detailed historical records, the origins of Candyman date back to the 1800s, and specifically to an individual named Daniel Robitaille. Now, Daniel was raised in a time of extensive slavery, and in spite of having an extremely difficult upbringing as such, he grew up to be a prominent and renowned painter. And while he never officially married, Daniel did find love in the company of a local woman, whose identity is removed from records entirely, likely because of the extreme circumstance surrounding both the events and the actual violent murder of Daniel himself. Now, when this woman becomes pregnant with Daniel's child, the woman's father, in a fit of racially charged aggression, sets upon Daniel himself with the help of a lynch mob. The details of Daniel Robitaille's murder are horrific. His right hand was first forcibly amputated and crudely replaced with that of a hook, after which the mob used a beehive from a nearby apiary to smear honey all over Daniel's torso. The resulting swarming attack from bees caused reportedly thousands of bee stings to his entire body, which likely sent him into a state of anaphylactic shock. Now, this mob fashions a pyre out of wood and debris, and Daniel was ultimately killed when he was set ablaze within the flames. His ashes were spread across the lands of Cabrini Green, and the murderous mob were neither arrested nor tried for their involvement in the crime. It's ultimately unclear how Daniel Robitaille gained the moniker of Candyman, but some attribute his name to his cause of death, and others to the offerings that believers of this tale would leave as a tribute to Robitaille himself, usually in the form of wrapped candies and treats of some kind. But the most prominent detail in the Candyman legend is probably the most haunting. The stories say that if one stands directly in front of a mirror, or any reflective surface really, and repeats the name Candyman a total of 5 times, Daniel Robitaille would appear, and he would ultimately take your life. Now, the legends of the Candyman became kind of a boogeyman tale in the community of Cabrini Green. Crime scene photos in the area depict detailed murals and tributes to the Candyman, and during her investigation, Helen Lyle reportedly became obsessed with the story. Now, her obsession would set into motion a drastic turn of events, resulting in her own demise when police arrest Helen for suspicion of murder in these recent string of killings in the area. Helen was awaiting trial for her possible involvement in these murders, including that of her closest friend, identified as Bernadette Walsh, when she somehow escaped her confines at a local psychiatric institution and proceeded to kidnap a small child. Now, she was tracked down by locals and also police, and she was ultimately killed in a fire that she reportedly started herself, possibly in an attempt to sacrifice this stolen child to the Candyman, though he thankfully survived the ordeal. And in the years following the events in 1992, the townspeople moved on from these Candyman legends. Now, all that would change almost 30 years later, when the stories of Candyman once again resurface, and a new series of violent killings begins. Now, fast forward to 2019, and the 92 case has been buried by both the local community and by police. At this point, the people of Chicago just want to move on entirely from these Candyman legends, but in spite of their best efforts, the story would find new life at the hands of a local artist and suspected serial killer, Anthony McCoy. Now, at the time of the 2019 murders, Anthony's working on establishing himself as a local painter, so far unsuccessful in this pursuit within the local artistic community. He soon finds new inspiration in the form of a local urban legend. Now, it's reported by survivor and then spousal partner Brianna Cartwright that Anthony first learned of the Candyman story from a friend, and shortly after sought further information regarding this legend. This reportedly included visits to the nearby Cabrini Green, the same location of the 1992 murders, as well as regular visits to a local laundromat owner, well versed in the stories and identified as William Burke, the same individual whose body would later be recovered at the final crime scene in the new Candyman case. Upon learning the story itself, Anthony became what would be described as simply obsessed with the legend, and he begins immediately incorporating the gruesome story and characters into his own works of art. Now, at this point, his friends and his cohorts are supportive of the endeavor. You gotta remember, it's been some time since Anthony has reportedly painted or expressed himself artistically, so basically any and all subject matter is deemed a step in the right direction, and his own subtext in the art itself, tackling topics like oppression and racism, were met with strong praise at their initial presentation. Now, it wouldn't take long, however, before Anthony's new muse would waver from artistic expression into unhealthy obsession, reflected not only in the art itself, but in Anthony's own mental and physical decline. Anthony McCoy's first manifestation of mental instability presents itself at a local art showing, held by his own partner Brianna, who actually owned the art gallery in question. It's reported by numerous witnesses that Anthony gets into a bit of an altercation with one of the observers, identified by police reports as Clive Privler, that culminates in an apparently intoxicated Anthony nearly physically assaulting the future victim. Anthony was escorted from the premises by concerned friends, and his ultimate whereabouts during the subsequent murders that evening could not be fully corroborated. Clive Privler would be the first murder victim of the new Candyman killings in 2019. His body is identified by police the following morning after he's found in a pool of blood in the same art gallery owned and operated by Brianna Cartwright. Crime scene photographs showcase a truly gruesome scene here, where both Clive and the body of his then-girlfriend Jerica Cooper are discovered by local authorities. The female victim was killed by a single laceration to her throat from a sharp object, the force of which nearly severed her head entirely. Blood spatter patterns at the scene indicate that she likely died almost immediately from massive blood loss. The male victim also reportedly had injuries to his Achilles tendon, and blood trails leading from the front entrance of the building indicate that he was possibly trying to escape the premises when the killer was able to successfully pull him back in. His ultimate cause of death was determined to also be from shock and extreme blood loss, stemming from a massive trauma wound to his torso, where crime scene photos indicate he was likely disemboweled by a sharp weapon that was not recovered from the scene of the crime. Now, entry wounds on both victims suggest that this weapon was oddly shaped and, most likely, some kind of a hook. Now, at this point, investigators obviously have some serious questions. These bodies were first reported to police by Brianna Cartwright herself after she discovered them upon opening the art gallery for the day. And after the very public altercation the night prior, both Brianna and, more importantly, Anthony McCoy are considered persons of interest in the murders. But according to DNA evidence and forensics at the scene of the crime, there is no solid leads linking Anthony himself to these actual murders. And given that no murder weapon can be located, police really at this point have nothing to go on but speculation. Now, this would be a recurring theme in the 2019 Candyman case and is often the very thing that lends itself to the infamous local superstitions surrounding the supernatural attributes to the crimes themselves. It isn't long before the next killing takes place. At this point, shortly after the initial murders at Night Driver Galleries, Anthony has reportedly continued to spiral. Police interviews with Brianna indicate that Anthony became increasingly reclusive, losing himself in his Candyman-inspired artwork, as well as locking himself in his studio for hours on end. And these behaviors soon manifest physically as well. Anthony develops some sort of infection on his hand that, as the case progresses, would reportedly spread to his arm and his torso. Hospital records indicate that Anthony did seek treatment for this supposed infection or irritation, and experts claim that this sort of physical manifestation is quite possible in extreme cases of both obsession and mental instability, sometimes even attributed to self-inflicted harm, even if the person themselves is completely unaware that they may have done so. This also explains the hospital records later on showing that Anthony did in fact visit the hospital to have these wounds treated, though whether or not it was a cause of his hand amputation, which we'll get to eventually, is really not entirely possible to confirm. Now, the following evening, the third victim of the Candyman killings would be murdered. The body of Finley Stevens, a prominent local art critic, is discovered in her own 19th floor apartment, having been killed by a slash to her throat. Blood patterns at the crime scene indicate a particularly violent turn of events, with spatter samples across the living room space as well as the actual glass window pane of the apartment itself, which police agree indicates a possible struggle with the assailant. And though once again no murder weapon is found, this time there's actually evidence linking a potential suspect to the scene. And that suspect is none other than Anthony McCoy. Security footage obtained by police shows that McCoy attended a late-night liaison at the building itself the night of the murder, and time of death records indicate that he may have actually been the last person to see Finley Stevens alive. Further DNA evidence at the crime scene indicates that Anthony was indeed present inside the apartment itself, from hair samples and fingerprints obtained from the main living space where Finley's body was actually found. And further adding to suspicion, Finley Stevens was also in the presence of Anthony McCoy a few nights prior, when she allegedly criticized his artwork at the same gallery at which the first victims were murdered. Anthony McCoy was confirmed to be having dinner with friends shortly after the murders took place. Now, this was corroborated by numerous other witnesses who attended this dinner, as well as credit card bills from the restaurant itself. But interestingly, when interviewed by police at the conclusion of these 2019 murders, guests at this dinner did report that Anthony seemed out of sorts and not entirely himself, and that he abruptly excused himself from the gathering after the group in question learned of Finley Stevens' murder. Now, this news came to them through local news reports. This is often considered further support in arguments that Anthony was involved and likely guilty in Finley's murder. Now, in the following days after the third killing, Brianna reports that Anthony's behavior has descended into the point of near mania. He's apparently been visiting his new friend and future person of interest in the case / victim, William Burke, who reports show shared Anthony's own obsession with the Candyman stories and possibly further fueled or inspired the new killings themselves. Anthony's various paintings, obtained as evidence from his apartment by police, showcase horrific portraits and violent scenes, which behavior and psychoanalysts attribute to his no doubt unstable inner turmoil around the murders and his alleged actions therein. At this point, Brianna feels physically unsafe in Anthony's presence, and she decides to remove herself from the situation until he can seek some kind of help in stabilizing himself. Now, this sudden and drastic change in Anthony's life is often what's attributed to the following murders, which are particularly violent and seemingly random, and this time at a local high school. The names of these victims are removed from the majority of police reports, likely to protect their identities and the identities of their families, especially given the fact that they're technically minors in this case. This time, the victims were 4 teenaged girls, who were found in yet another brutal and bloody crime scene in the bathroom of their own high school. Police find the same MO in the victims' deaths, with their throats being slashed by a weapon that could not be located. But entry wounds are consistent with the same hook-shaped weapon as prior victims. Now this time, the murder took place in broad daylight, and while there's no linking DNA evidence at the scene, there actually is one surviving witness. Another student at the school was present at the time of these murders, and she had locked herself in the bathroom stall shortly before the murders took place. Though police records indicate that this survivor had no affiliation with the victims and could not fully identify the suspect in the murders, she does claim that she caught a glimpse of a man in the bathroom, and if you believe the reports, this man had a hook for a hand. Now, some believe that this could easily be confused with somebody carrying this hook weapon, which is a more popular theory for the practical followers of this case. But ultimately, police don't really have a heck of a lot to go on here. This male suspect could really be anyone, and there's no records of him entering or exiting the building from any of the other students or faculty. There is, however, one piece of interesting information that police obtain that ties a potentially dotted line to suspect Anthony McCoy. At least one of these new victims attended an art show recently, and it was the same art show that all of the other victims had visited a few nights prior. And as if that wasn't enough, further implicating Anthony in these murders, a message was found on the mirror of the bathroom wall at the crime scene, reportedly written in one of the victims' blood. And according to crime scene photographs, the message, clearly on display, stated, "Say my name," which was actually the same name as the art piece that Anthony McCoy had submitted at the Night Driver galleries. Now, at this point, many understandably question why police didn't simply arrest Anthony McCoy. There seems to be more than enough evidence supporting his involvement, and certainly enough to at least question him in the murders. Reports indicate that police were, in fact, actively searching for McCoy in an attempt to bring him in. But apart from the aforementioned hospital records indicating a recent visit, the simple fact is nobody can find Anthony anywhere. And that would be a fact that would very soon change. The events of the 2019 Candyman murders culminate in a truly bloody and violent fashion. Victim statements indicate that in an attempt to locate a now missing Anthony McCoy, assumed by investigators to be eluding police apprehension, Brianna Cartwright seeks the assistance of William Burke, the only known acquaintance of the murder suspect. Now you have to think here, even though Anthony has presented some obvious behavioral patterns, indicating that he's both dangerous and quite possibly the Candyman killer, Brianna still deep down cares for this person and wants ultimately for their healthy return. And right now, the only information she has to go on is Anthony's obsession with this character of legend. However, in seeking assistance from William Burke, Brianna unknowingly has made a terrible mistake. Now, in a turn that makes complete sense looking back at the case, but may have not been so obvious at the time, William instead reveals his own twisted obsession with the Candyman legends, and ultimately kidnaps Brianna, holding her against her will at an abandoned church property in Cabrini Green. It's often theorized that William Burke not only fed into Anthony McCoy's mental decline, but also may have served as his accomplice to murder in these Candyman killings themselves, possibly providing victim information and even cleaning up after the crime scenes, which would explain why there was never any DNA evidence. Now, it's important to note that these theories are simply just theories. It's not actually confirmed by police. But it does make sense when you take a look at the facts of the case and the actual outcome of the Candyman murders. Police eventually recovered research documents as well as audio recordings from McCoy's own apartment, including extensive files from prior Candyman killer Helen Lyle. Now, these discoveries lend themselves to the ongoing theory that Anthony McCoy had likely become obsessed with the Candyman legends over a period of time, and that coupled with his also obsessed accomplice William and Anthony's own declining mental health, it's really not too much of a stretch to see how this obsession may have manifested with Anthony physically, ultimately pushing him over the edge to commit murder. Now, back at this abandoned church in the familiar area of Cabrini Green, Brianna's police statement indicates that she finds an unresponsive Anthony McCoy, who's dressed in clothing representing that of the fabled Daniel Robitaille, or at least clothing that matches the descriptors from limited witnesses to both the 1992 murders as well as the 2019 murders, and in addition, artist depictions of Robitaille across the community in the various murals that are found painted in Cabrini green. Brianna also claims that she witnesses the deranged William Burke sever Anthony's right hand, using the blade of a hacksaw to remove and replace the extremity with none other than a metal hook. Now, to pause here, it's important to note that investigators of the case tend to dispute this piece of information, theorizing that it's more likely that McCoy either affixed the hook to his own person or just used it as a murder weapon by hand throughout the case. Though there's no DNA evidence to support this claim, as we covered earlier, forensics do suggest that this hook-like weapon is consistent with the potential murder weapon used in the previous killings, noted by the shape of the weapon itself and the unique entry wound it would leave on its victims' bodies, as well as the spatter resulting from the lacerations. As such, it's highly agreed upon that this is likely the same weapon used in all of the 2019 killings. Now, interestingly, autopsy reports do show that at some point, this hook was physically inserted into the stump on McCoy's right arm. And while William Burke was also found dead at the scene, he actually was not a victim of Anthony McCoy. William Burke was killed by an escaping Brianna Cartwright, who manages to subdue her captor and attacks him with a simple ballpoint pen that she'd had on her person. Burke suffered a total of 20 stab wounds to the throat, and ultimately, and probably ironically, succumbed to massive blood loss from the resulting wounds. But that would not be the end of the body count in the 2019 Candyman murders. Records indicate that police received an anonymous tip about the whereabouts of Anthony McCoy, which is often theorized to have been provided by none other than William Burke at some point during the kidnapping of Brianna Cartwright. When police eventually respond to the scene, they find the surviving victim, Brianna, as well as the bodies of 4 police officers, who were reportedly the first responders at the crime scene itself. 3 of the officers were found nearby their vehicles, having been killed by the same method as the other victims in the case, their throats slit by a hook-like weapon. Ballistics also recovered numerous expended rounds from the officers' weapons, indicating that they had discharged their weapons at an unknown assailant, which is theorized to be that of an attacking Anthony McCoy. Now, the 4th responding officer's body is found in an alleyway nearby the crime scene, and he was also killed in the same fashion. The final body recovered at the scene of the crime is none other than Anthony McCoy himself, the suspected Candyman killer, who was found in a nearby abandoned building. He was determined to have been killed by numerous gunshot wounds fired by the aforementioned responding law enforcement, which fatally struck his torso. Medical reports indicate that McCoy was likely already suffering from extensive blood loss from the wrist at the time of his death, due to the amputation of his hand, and without proper medical attention, he may have succumbed to this wound if he had not been shot by police. But there's an interesting and often controversial part to this crime scene. While Anthony's body was found inside the building, time of death reports actually seem to suggest that he expired before that of the responding officers, who, as we know, were located deceased outside of the building itself. Now, a popular theory to this is that Anthony may have attacked and subsequently fatally wounded the officers outside before being shot, or he may have retreated into the building and therein died from his wounds. However, ballistics show that at least one officer discharged their weapon inside the building, so it's possible that in an attempt to pursue McCoy, this officer followed him into the building and he was mortally wounded before stumbling back outside where he ultimately died. But the sole surviving witness tells another story entirely. In police interviews and famously in interviews with media following these 2019 murders, Brianna Cartwright claims that responding officers shot and killed Anthony McCoy first, and that the murderer in question was none other than the mythical Candyman himself. Now, as always, whether or not you believe the superstitious side of the story is completely up to you. The facts of the case indicate that the Candyman killer of 2019 was, in fact, Anthony McCoy, possibly assisted and abetted by William Burke, and that he was killed by police in an altercation on that fateful night in Chicago, Illinois. But while his biological body was pronounced dead, locals in the area still believe that his spirit may live on, just like the other Candyman of the past, and that the legacy of the original Candyman, Daniel Robitaille, may not be over just yet. Thanks for listening to our true crime spin on Candyman. There's actually 3 prior Candyman films, though I've admittedly only seen the first one in the original trilogy. And I think that with this new film, it was a smart move to treat it like a legacy sequel, still acknowledging the other movies as canon, while also kind of doing its own thing to breathe new life into the story and to the mythos. The 2021 movie is available on multiple platforms to stream or purchase, so if you're interested, I would definitely check it out. There seems to be pretty mixed opinions out there, but I really enjoyed this new entry, and I thought it was an interesting take on the story itself. Plus, the performances were great, and it's always a pleasure to see Tony Todd as Candyman, even though it's a very brief cameo appearance in this one. Tony Todd was an icon of horror, who not only popularized Candyman, but also appeared in countless other horror films throughout his impressive career. Now, sadly, Tony passed away this last week, so this episode is dedicated to him. Rest in peace, Mr. Todd. And that's it for today's episode. Join us next Tuesday as we cover off a holiday special of sorts with a 2024 horror film that's probably best served with a side of gravy and cranberry sauce. Until then, I'm your host, Evan Taggart, and this has been Inside the Mask.